The morning sky over Earth turned dark as shadows fell across every continent. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant, watching his radar screen fill with impossible contacts. 50 massive ships hung in the atmosphere, like black clouds, each one larger than any structure humans had ever built. The alien vessels moved with perfect precision, their hulls gleaming with a strange blue light that hurt to look at directly. Jake had been in the Navy for 15 years. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. The radio crackled with panicked voices from bases around the world. Tokyo reported the same thing as New York, London, and Moscow. The aliens had arrived everywhere at once, and they were not here to talk. Commander Vextal stood tall in the aisles, command center of his flagship, his crystalline body reflecting the soft glow of the ship's controls. His species had conquered 17 worlds, and Earth would be the 18th. The planet below looked blue and green through the viewing ports, covered in chaotic weather patterns that his sensors found difficult to read. This primitive world would fall within days, just like all the others. The first attack came without warning. Beams of pure energy lanced down from the alien ships, striking military bases and government buildings with surgical precision. The Pentagon vanished in a flash of light. NORAD went silent. Aircraft carriers in the Pacific Ocean became twisted metal in seconds. Earth's defenses, built to fight other humans, were useless against technology that seemed like magic. Dr. Lisa Park was working late in her lab at the Centers for Disease Control when the power went out. Through her window, she could see Atlanta burning in the distance. The radio on her desk reported that similar attacks were happening worldwide. As a disease expert, Lisa understood patterns, and this pattern was clear. The aliens were taking out humanity's ability to fight back in an organized way. In the first few hours, something unexpected happened. A massive hurricane spinning in the Atlantic Ocean seemed to bend the alien energy beams, sending them off course. Several shots meant for naval bases hit empty water instead. In Iceland, a volcano that had been quiet for months suddenly erupted, filling the sky with ash that seemed to confuse the alien sensors. Their targeting became less accurate, and some shots missed entirely. The aliens did not seem concerned by these minor problems. Within 6 hours, landing craft began descending from the mother ships. Each craft carried 100 warriors, tall beings with bodies that looked like they were made of living crystal. They moved with grace and purpose, their weapons humming with the same blue energy that powered their ships. Marine Sergeant Tony Blake watched the first aliens land from his position in the hills outside Denver. Through his binoculars, he could see them setting up some kind of base camp. The beings were at least 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished glass. They wore no armor, but seemed to have some kind of shield around their bodies that made the air shimmer. Tony had fought in 3 wars, but he had never seen anything like this. When his squad opened fire with their rifles, the bullets simply bounced off the alien shields. The creatures turned toward the human position with what might have been curiosity, then returned a single energy blast that melted the rocks where the Marines had been hiding. Only Tony's quick thinking to order a retreat saved their lives. Engineer Amy Foster was trapped in her apartment building in Chicago when the aliens landed in Grant Park. From her window, she watched them work with incredible efficiency. They set up structures that seemed to grow from the ground, creating a base that was both beautiful and terrible. The aliens moved like dancers, each one knowing exactly what to do without any visible communication. Amy was good at solving problems, and she could see that humanity's technology was completely outmatched. But she also noticed something else. The aliens stayed close to their base, never venturing far into the city. When they did move, they seemed to prefer open areas and avoided places with lots of plants or water. It was a small observation, but Amy filed it away in her mind. the global resistance began forming within hours of the invasion. Military units that had survived the initial strikes went underground. Police officers became guerrilla fighters. Ordinary citizens picked up weapons and formed groups to protect their neighborhoods. The aliens had expected quick surrender, but humans had never been good at giving up. Captain Jake Morrison found himself in command of a mixed group of Navy personnel and civilians after the Defiant was destroyed in port. They had retreated to the mountains of Colorado, where the thin air and rocky terrain seemed to slow down the alien patrols. Jake noticed that the crystalline beings moved more slowly at high altitude, and their energy weapons seemed to have reduced range. Dr. Lisa Park managed to escape Atlanta with a small team of researchers and medical supplies. They set up a hidden laboratory in an abandoned mine, where Lisa began studying everything she could about the invaders. She collected samples of destroyed alien equipment and tried to understand how their technology worked. More importantly, she began to notice that the aliens seemed to avoid certain areas entirely. The first week of occupation was brutal for humanity. Cities burned, governments collapsed, and millions of people died or fled their homes. But the aliens also faced unexpected challenges. Their sensors, designed for the sterile environments of their conquered worlds, struggled with Earth's chaotic weather patterns. Storms interfered with their communications, and the planet's magnetic field seemed to affect their navigation systems. Commander Vexta received reports from his ground forces that confused him. The humans were more resilient than expected, but that was not unusual. What was strange was that his own troops were reporting fatigue and minor health issues. The ship's medical computers found nothing wrong with them, but the symptoms were spreading through the ranks. By the end of the first week, the pattern was clear to those who knew how to look. The aliens had superior technology and had won every major battle, but they had not won the war. Earth itself seemed to be fighting back, using weapons that the invaders could not understand or defend against. The conquest was complete, but something was wrong, and it was getting worse every day. 3 months had passed since the silver ships first darkened Earth's skies, and Commander Vextal was beginning to understand that conquest was not always what it seemed. His magnificent crystalline body, once a symbol of Zelfarian perfection, now showed hairline cracks along his arms and chest. The stress fractures appeared first as thin lines, barely visible, but they grew deeper each day. His officers reported the same symptoms, spreading through their ranks like a slow poison. Dr. Lisa Park crouched in her hidden laboratory, surrounded by microscopes and computers, powered by stolen alien energy cells. She had been studying the invaders for months, collecting samples whenever resistance fighters brought back pieces of destroyed equipment or, more rarely, alien tissue from skirmishes. What she found changed everything she thought she knew about the war. The breakthrough came when she examined a piece of Zelfarian armor that had been damaged in a firefight near the Mississippi River. The crystalline material showed signs of microscopic erosion, as if something was eating away at it from the outside. Lisa ran the sample through every test she could think of, and the results were incredible. The armor was being attacked by common Earth bacteria, organisms so basic that they existed everywhere on the planet. Lisa called Captain Jake Morrison on the encrypted radio system that the Resistance had built from scavenged parts. Her voice was excited as she explained her discovery. The aliens were not just getting sick, they were being poisoned by Earth's own life. Their home world, she realized, must have been completely sterile, without the countless microorganisms that humans lived with every day. Jake Morrison had been leading hit-and-run attacks from his mountain base, but his latest mission had shown him something that supported Lisa's theory. His team had ambushed an alien patrol near a swamp in Louisiana, and the Zelfarians had moved like they were underwater. Their usual grace was gone, replaced by clumsy, desperate movements. One of them had actually fallen down, something Jake had never seen before. The resistance fighters had noticed other changes too. The aliens avoided forests now, staying on roads and in open areas. They no longer landed their ships near rivers or lakes. When they did venture into areas with heavy vegetation, they moved in sealed vehicles and never stayed long. It was as if they were afraid of the very air they breathed. Engineer Amy Foster had been working with a group of survivors in Chicago, turning the ruined city into a maze of traps and hidden passages. She was the first to realize that the aliens' behavior was not random. They were trying to avoid something, and that something was everywhere on Earth. Amy began mapping the areas where aliens were most active, and she discovered they preferred places that humans had made sterile, like hospitals and laboratories. The resistance began to change its tactics. Instead of trying to fight the aliens with weapons that barely scratched their shields, they started using Earth itself as a weapon. They would lead alien patrols into swamps, where the air was thick with moisture and microscopic life. They would sabotage the aliens' air filtration systems, forcing them to breathe unfiltered Earth air. Most effective of all, they would simply wait. Dr. Richard Hayes was a military doctor who had been studying captured alien medical equipment. He had learned to read their diagnostic displays, and what he saw there terrified him. The aliens' immune systems were incredibly advanced, but they were designed to fight specific threats. On Earth, they were like sophisticated computers trying to run software they had never seen before. The system was crashing, and the aliens were dying. Commander Vextal stood in his command center, watching the reports from his ground forces with growing despair. His army of 50,000 elite warriors had been reduced to 30,000 in just 3 months, and the losses were accelerating. The humans had not defeated them in battle, but they were losing the war anyway. His own reflection in the polished walls showed a being he barely recognized, marked by the spreading cracks that no medicine could heal. The aliens tried everything they could think of to solve the problem. They developed new air filters, better medical treatments, and stronger protective suits. Nothing worked for long. The microscopic enemies were too small to see, too numerous to count, and too adaptable to defeat. Earth's biosphere had been fighting invisible wars for billions of years, and the aliens were losing battles they did not even know they were fighting. Sub-Commander Kethros was the first to suggest what others were afraid to think. Perhaps they could not win this war in the traditional way. His forces in the Pacific Northwest were down to half strength, and his best warriors could barely stand during combat. The humans they were supposed to be conquering were healthier and stronger than his own troops. It was a humiliation that the Zeltharian Empire had never experienced. Amy Foster made another crucial discovery while studying alien behavior patterns. The invaders were not just avoiding dangerous areas. They were actively seeking out places where humans had eliminated natural life. They took over chemical plants, nuclear facilities, and industrial complexes. These were the only places on Earth where they could function normally, and there were not enough of them to house the entire invasion force. The aliens began to retreat into increasingly smaller areas, creating sealed environments where they could survive. But every time they opened a door or ventured outside, they were exposed to Earth's endless variety of life. Their technology could protect them for a while, but it could not protect them forever. The planet was patient, and it was winning. Captain Morrison organized a meeting of resistance leaders in an abandoned mine shaft in Colorado. The gathered fighters represented what remained of Earth's military forces, but they were no longer the desperate survivors they had been 3 months ago. They were becoming hunters, and their prey was getting weaker every day. Dr. Lisa Park presented her findings to the group, explaining how Earth's microscopic life was accomplishing what nuclear weapons could not. The aliens were not evil, she realized, just completely unprepared for a world that teemed with life. Their empire had probably sterilized their own planet long ago, creating a perfect environment for their species, but leaving them vulnerable to places like Earth. The Resistance began to coordinate their efforts, sharing information about alien weak points and safe zones. They learned to use Earth's biodiversity as a weapon, leading alien forces into areas where the concentration of microorganisms was highest. The aliens' own superior technology became a trap, as their detailed scans and measurements only confirmed what they already knew. They were dying, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. By the end of the third month, the pattern was clear to everyone. The aliens were still technically in control of Earth, but their control was slipping away like sand through their fingers. Their proud empire was learning the hardest lesson of all, that conquest means nothing if you cannot survive in the place you have conquered. Earth was teaching them that lesson one microscopic battle at a time, and the aliens were finally beginning to understand that they might have made a terrible mistake. 6 months after the invasion began, the Zelfarian Empire faced something they had never experienced in their long history of conquest: complete and total failure. Commander Vextal stood in his medical bay, watching his reflection in the polished metal walls. The cracks in his crystalline skin had spread from thin lines to deep fractures that glowed with a sickly light. His personal physician, Medtech Zoran, could only shake his head in defeat. The mighty invasion force of 50,000 warriors had been reduced to fewer than 20,000, and the survivors were no longer the proud soldiers who had arrived to claim another world for their empire. They huddled in sealed facilities, afraid to breathe the air of the planet they had come to conquer. Their advanced technology, capable of destroying cities in seconds, was useless against enemies they could not see or fight. Dr. Lisa Park had become something she never expected to be: a weapon designer. But her weapons were not made of metal or explosives. They were made of life itself. Working with other scientists in hidden laboratories around the world, she had cataloged hundreds of Earth microorganisms that were deadly to the aliens. Most effective were the simplest, common bacteria that lived in soil, water, and air. The Resistance had learned to use this knowledge with devastating effect. They would sabotage alien air filtration systems, introducing samples of Earth's most aggressive microorganisms into the aliens' supposedly safe environments. They would contaminate water supplies that the aliens tried to purify. Most cruelly of all, they would simply wait, knowing that time was on their side. Captain Jake Morrison led a daring raid on a Zelfarian medical facility in what used to be Denver. His team moved through the ruins of the city like ghosts, avoiding the few remaining alien patrols. The facility was a gleaming tower that looked out of place among the destroyed buildings, its clean lines and sterile surfaces a stark contrast to the chaotic human architecture that surrounded it. The raid was not meant to destroy the facility. Jake had learned from Dr. Park that the aliens were conducting desperate research, trying to understand what was killing them. He wanted that research. Breaking into the facility was surprisingly easy because the aliens had pulled back their guards to protect more critical locations. Inside, Jake found something that shocked him. The aliens had built a detailed map of Earth's biosphere that was more complete than anything human science had ever created. The alien computers contained terabytes of data about Earth's microscopic life, cataloged with the precision and desperation of a species fighting for survival. They had identified thousands of organisms that were toxic to their biology, and they had mapped the entire planet based on the concentration of these invisible killers. To the aliens, Earth was not a blue and green paradise, but a nightmare world, painted in shades of death. Engineer Amy Foster was working with a team of survivors in the ruins of Chicago when she received an encrypted message that changed everything. The message was not from other humans. It was from the aliens themselves, transmitted on a frequency that the Resistance had been monitoring. The message was simple. They wanted to talk. Sub-Commander Kethros had made the decision without authorization from his superiors. His forces in the Pacific Northwest were down to 3,000 survivors, and they were dying faster every day. The humans in his sector had stopped attacking entirely, content to wait for his troops to simply fade away. He had two choices: die with honor according to the Empire's traditions, or do something that had never been done before in Zeltharian history. The first contact meeting took place in an abandoned school in Portland, Oregon. The building had been chosen because it was relatively free of the microorganisms that were so deadly to the aliens. Kethros arrived wearing a full environmental suit, his crystalline features barely visible through the protective mask. Across from him sat Amy Foster, Captain Morrison, and Dr. Richard Hayes, who had learned to speak the alien language using captured translation devices. The conversation was awkward at first. The aliens had never negotiated with their subjects before, and the humans had never imagined that their conquerors might be desperate enough to ask for help. But as the hours passed, both sides began to understand each other in ways that neither had expected. Kethros explained that his people had never encountered a world like Earth. Their empire had conquered 17 planets, but all of them had been sterile worlds like their own homeworld. They had assumed that all life in the universe followed the same patterns they understood. Earth was an impossible place in their experience, a world where countless species lived together in chaotic harmony. Dr. Hayes shared some of Lisa Park's research, explaining how Earth's biosphere worked. The aliens listened with fascination and horror as he described the invisible war that was being fought inside their own bodies. Their immune systems, designed to fight known threats, were being overwhelmed by organisms that evolved and adapted faster than their technology could track. Amy Foster made a proposal that seemed impossible: cooperation. The aliens had technology that could solve many of Earth's problems, and humans had the biological knowledge that the aliens needed to survive. Working together, they might be able to create solutions that neither species could achieve alone. The negotiations were dangerous for both sides. Most humans wanted to see the aliens die, and most aliens considered any cooperation with their subjects to be treason. But the alternative was clear. The aliens would continue to die, and the humans would inherit a world poisoned by the debris of alien technology. Captain Morrison established a secret communication network between the resistance and the surviving alien commanders. Not all of them were willing to talk, but enough were desperate enough to consider alternatives to death. The aliens began sharing medical data, and the humans began sharing biological samples and research. Dr. Lisa Park worked with captured alien scientists to develop the first experimental treatments. The process was incredibly dangerous because it involved deliberately exposing the aliens to controlled doses of Earth's microorganisms while their immune systems learned to fight them. Many of the early test subjects died, but a few survived, and their survival gave hope to both species. The first successful treatment created something that had never existed before: a Zeltharian who could breathe Earth's air without immediately dying. The process was agonizing and changed the aliens in fundamental ways. Their crystalline skin became duller, their movements slower, and their perfect health was replaced by the constant low-level warfare that all Earth life experienced. But they were alive, and they were learning. The adapted aliens began to understand Earth in ways that their pure-blood cousins never could. They could feel the microscopic battles being fought in their own bodies, and they began to appreciate the incredible complexity of the world they had tried to conquer. Commander Vextau faced the hardest decision of his career. His empire would never accept what his forces had become. If he returned home, he would be executed for failure. If he stayed on Earth, he would have to accept that his people were no longer conquerors, but refugees, dependent on the mercy of the species they had tried to enslave. the choice was made for him when long-range sensors detected the approach of the Second Invasion Fleet. The Empire had sent reinforcements, unaware that the first wave had not just failed, but had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The survivors faced a new dilemma: warn their own people about Earth's deadly nature or help defend this world that had become their only possible home. The war was about to enter a new phase, one that neither species had ever imagined. The aliens had come as conquerors, but Earth had turned them into something else entirely. The question now was whether they could learn to live with that transformation, or whether they would be destroyed by their own people, who still believed that conquest was possible on a world that had already proven them wrong. 1 year after the first ships had darkened Earth's skies, the world had become something that neither species could have imagined. The proud Zelfarian invasion force had been reduced to 12,000 survivors, scattered across the planet, in small groups that bore no resemblance to the mighty army that had once terrorized humanity. These were no longer conquerors, but refugees, dependent on the very species they had tried to enslave. Commander Vikstall stood in what had once been his command center, now converted into a medical facility where the transformation process took place. His own body showed the effects of the treatment that Dr. Lisa Park and the alien scientist Mordain had developed together. His crystalline skin had lost its perfect shine, becoming dull and rough like weathered stone. His movements were slower, more careful, as if he was still learning how to live in a body that was no longer purely Zelfarian. The transformation process was not just physical, but psychological. The aliens who underwent the treatment found themselves changed in ways that went far beyond their appearance. They could feel the microscopic life that lived within their bodies, the constant battle between their immune systems and Earth's organisms. For a species that had known only sterile perfection, this internal warfare was both terrifying and fascinating. Dr. Lisa Park worked alongside Mordain in a laboratory that had been built from both human and alien technology. The Zelfarian scientist had been one of the first to volunteer for the adaptation process, and the change in him was remarkable. His once proud bearing had been replaced by something that humans would recognize as humility. He spoke of Earth's biosphere with the reverence of a student rather than the arrogance of a conqueror. Captain Jake Morrison found himself in a role he had never expected: protector of the aliens he had once fought. Human extremist groups had formed in several cities, demanding the extermination of all Zelfarians, even those who had undergone the transformation. Jake led a mixed force of humans and adapted aliens to defend the refugee settlements, fighting his own species to protect beings who had once been his enemies. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. The aliens had killed millions of humans during the invasion, destroyed cities, and shattered the world's governments. But the survivors were not the same beings who had committed those crimes. They were changed physically and mentally into something that was neither fully alien nor fully compatible with Earth. Life. Engineer Amy Foster oversaw the construction of the first integrated settlement in the ruins of what had been Portland. The community was an experiment in interspecies cooperation, with buildings designed to accommodate both human and alien needs. The adapted Zelfarians required different atmospheric conditions than humans, but they could now survive in the same general environment. The settlement became a model for other communities that were slowly forming around the world. The adapted aliens brought knowledge that revolutionized human understanding of technology and science. In exchange, they learned from humans about agriculture, ecology, and the art of living with rather than dominating the natural world. Former Zelfarian warriors became farmers, learning to work with Earth's soil and weather. Scientists who had once mapped stellar conquest routes now studied the migration patterns of birds and the life cycles of insects. Sub-Commander Kethros, who now went by the human name Kevin, had become something unprecedented in Zelfarian history. a citizen of the world he had helped invade. He worked as a teacher in the Portland settlement, sharing alien knowledge with human children while learning human history and culture. His students, both human and adapted Zeltharian, represented the first generation to grow up in a world where both species coexisted. Dr. Richard Hayes documented the incredible changes taking place in Zeltharian society. The rigid hierarchy that had defined their empire for millennia collapsed under the pressure of survival. Rank and status became meaningless when former generals worked alongside former enlisted soldiers to tend crops and maintain water purification systems. The aliens were learning democracy through necessity, making decisions by consensus rather than by command. The transformation was not without its costs. Many aliens died during the adaptation process, their bodies unable to handle the shock of Earth's biosphere. Others survived the physical changes, but were broken by the psychological trauma of becoming something their own species would consider contaminated. Suicide rates among the adapted aliens were high, and both human and Zeltharian medical teams worked together to provide support. But for those who survived and adapted, the transformation brought unexpected gifts. The adapted aliens developed a connection to Earth's biosphere that even humans did not possess. They could sense changes in weather patterns, detect the health of plants and animals, and predict natural disasters with uncanny accuracy. They were becoming something new, a bridge between two very different forms of life. The first adapted alien children were born in the settlement outside Denver. These youngsters were different from their parents, born with immune systems that were already partially adapted to Earth's environment. They played with human children, learning both languages and both cultures. To them, the war between their species was ancient history, something their parents talked about, but which had no meaning in their daily lives. Commander Vextal watched the children play and realized that his species had gained something it had never possessed before, the ability to change and grow. The Zeltharian Empire had achieved perfection through control and stagnation, but these hybrid communities were achieving something better through adaptation and cooperation. The children represented hope for a future that neither species could have imagined. The threat of the approaching reinforcement fleet loomed over all these developments. Long-range sensors showed that Admiral Zexvon was leading a force twice the size of the original invasion fleet, confident that overwhelming numbers would succeed where the first wave had failed. The survivors faced an impossible choice: warn their own people about Earth's deadly nature and face execution for treason, or help defend the world that had become their only possible home. Amy Foster proposed a radical solution during a meeting of the Settlement Council. Instead of fighting the new fleet or trying to hide from it, they would send a message explaining what had happened. The message would be broadcast on all frequencies, showing the world what the survivors had become and offering the same choice to the newcomers: adapt or die. The message was recorded by both human and adapted alien leaders, standing together in the integrated settlement that had become their shared home. They spoke of the lessons they had learned, the prices they had paid, and the hope they had found in cooperation rather than conquest. The message ended with an invitation. The reinforcement fleet could land and begin their own transformation, or they could turn back and report to their empire what they had seen. Captain Morrison prepared for the possibility that the new fleet would choose to fight rather than negotiate. The adapted aliens had retained much of their technological knowledge, and they were now working with humans to develop new defensive systems. But the real defense was Earth itself, the invisible army of microorganisms that had defeated the first invasion force and stood ready to defeat the second as the reinforcement fleet approached. The survivors realized that they had become something that neither of their original species would recognize. They were no longer purely human or purely Zeltharian, but something new and unique. They had learned to live with each other and with Earth itself, creating communities that were more resilient and adaptable than anything either species had achieved alone. The war that had begun with conquest was ending with transformation. The aliens had come to change Earth, but Earth had changed them instead. Now they faced the ultimate test. Could they convince their own people to accept the same transformation? Or would they be forced to defend their new world against the very empire they had once served? The answer would determine the future of both species and the fate of the planet that had taught them all the most important lesson of all. That survival requires not just strength, but the wisdom to change. 2 years after the first invasion, the Zeltharian reinforcement fleet emerged from hyperspace to find a world that defied everything they thought they knew about conquest. Admiral Zexivon stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the sensor. Readings with growing confusion. The planet below showed no signs of the typical Imperial occupation. Instead of the sterile bases and organized extraction facilities that marked successful conquests, Earth teemed with the same chaotic life that had been there before the invasion. The first communication that reached the fleet was not from Commander Vextal or any other Imperial officer. It came from a joint human-Zeltharian broadcast station in what had once been called New Geneva, the first truly integrated city that had risen from the ruins of the old world. The message was delivered by both species together, their voices harmonizing in a way that made Admiral Zexivon's crystalline skin crawl with disgust. Captain Jake Morrison stood beside Commander Vextal as they recorded the message that would change everything. Vextal's appearance shocked the Admiral. His once perfect crystalline form was now weathered and dull, marked by the scars of adaptation. His movements were slower, more thoughtful, as if he was constantly aware of the microscopic battles being fought within his own body. This was not the proud commander who had led the Third Fleet to glory. Dr. Lisa Park and the alien scientist Mordain had worked together to prepare a detailed report of what had happened during the first invasion. Their presentation was broadcast to every ship in the fleet, showing the progression of the biological warfare that had devastated the original force. The data was undeniable. Earth's biosphere was lethal to unprotected Zeltharians, and no amount of technology could change that fundamental fact. Not the message explained the choice that faced the new arrivals. They could attempt another invasion and face the same fate as their predecessors, or they could land and begin the painful process of adaptation. The survivors made it clear that they would defend their new world if necessary, but they hoped that their own people would choose wisdom over pride. Admiral Zexivon's response was predictable. He declared the survivors to be contaminated traitors and ordered the immediate bombardment of all human-alien settlements. But his fleet faced a problem that the first invasion had not encountered. The adapted aliens knew exactly how to defend against Zeltharian technology. Their weapons were blocked by shields that used both human and alien science, and their targeting systems were confused by organic countermeasures that the pure blood Zeltharians had never seen before. The battle that followed was unlike any in galactic history. The adapted aliens fought alongside humans to defend settlements that belonged to both species. Their combined knowledge created defensive systems that were both high-tech and organic, using Earth's own biosphere as a weapon against the invaders. Clouds of engineered microorganisms disabled alien ships, while human guerrilla tactics kept the landing forces off balance. But the real victory came not from weapons, but from choice. Sub-Commander Kethros, now known as Kevin, led a team of adapted aliens in a desperate mission to reach the flagship of the reinforcement fleet. They broadcast directly to the ship's crew, showing them what they had become and explaining what they had learned about survival on Earth. The crew of the flagship watched in horror as their former comrades described the transformation process. But they also saw something that their rigid society had never shown them: happiness. The adapted aliens spoke of communities where different species worked together, where children played without fear, and where the future was built on cooperation. Rather than conquest, engineer Amy Foster had designed the integrated city of New Geneva as a showcase of what was possible when two species learned to live together. The city's organic architecture blended human creativity with alien precision, creating structures that were both beautiful and functional. Gardens grew on every building, and the air itself was carefully balanced to support both human and adapted Zeltharian life. The children of New Geneva became the most powerful argument for the new way of life. Human and adapted alien youngsters played together in the parks, speaking both languages and understanding both cultures. They represented something that had never existed before, a generation that saw cooperation as natural and war as an ancient mistake. When these children appeared in the broadcast to the fleet, many of the younger crew members began to question their orders. Dr. Richard Hayes had established medical facilities throughout the integrated settlements, staffed by both human and adapted alien doctors. These facilities became the first places where members of the reinforcement fleet could undergo the transformation process. The procedure was still dangerous and painful, but it was the only way to survive long-term on Earth. The first defections from the reinforcement fleet began within weeks of their arrival. Young officers and enlisted personnel, horrified by the prospect of destroying the hybrid communities, secretly landed on Earth and requested asylum. They were taken to the medical facilities, where they began the long process of adaptation. Many died, but those who survived joined the growing population of beings who belonged to both worlds. Admiral Zexavon found his fleet shrinking as more and more of his people chose transformation over conquest. The pure-blood Zeltharians who remained loyal to the Empire retreated to increasingly isolated positions, unable to land safely on a planet that was poisoned to their biology. They faced the same choice that had confronted the first invasion. Adapt or die. Commander Vextal led a final diplomatic mission to his former superior, arriving at the flagship in a specially designed shuttle that could protect both species. During the journey, the meeting between the two commanders was tense, with Zexavon struggling to recognize the being who had once been his most trusted officer. Vextal spoke of the lessons he had learned, the community he had helped build, and the future he had found in cooperation rather than conquest. The conversation that followed lasted for hours, with Vextal describing the transformation not just of his body, but of his entire worldview. He spoke of human children who called him uncle, of alien youngsters who learned to farm from human teachers, and of a society where strength came from diversity rather than uniformity. He offered his former superior the same choice that Earth offered to everyone: learn to live with life or be destroyed by it. Admiral Zexavon ultimately chose to retreat, taking the remaining pure-blood Zeltharians back to their empire to report on what they had found. But nearly half of his fleet remained behind, their crews choosing to join the communities that had grown from the ashes of the first invasion. The Empire would have to decide whether to accept these refugees or declare them outcasts. But that was a problem for the future. The ships that stayed were quickly converted into orbital habitats where the transformation process could begin safely. Dr. Lisa Park and Mordain worked around the clock to treat the thousands of aliens who had chosen adaptation over retreat. The process was streamlined now, safer than it had been in the early days. But it was still a fundamental change that affected every aspect of Zeltharian biology and psychology. Captain Jake Morrison was appointed as the first human ambassador to the integrated communities, helping to negotiate the complex treaties and agreements that would govern this new world. He worked closely with adapted alien leaders like Kevin and Vextal to create laws that protected both species while encouraging cooperation and growth. The transformation of Earth continued as more settlements were built around the world. Each community was unique, reflecting the local environment and the mix of human and alien cultures that had grown there. Some focused on agriculture, using combined knowledge to create crops that could feed both species. Others became centers of learning, where the greatest minds of both races worked together to push the boundaries of science and technology. Engineer Amy Foster became the chief architect of this new world, designing cities that were living ecosystems rather than sterile structures. Her buildings breathed with the planet, filtering air and water while providing homes for countless species. The integrated communities became models of sustainable living that amazed visitors from both races. The children born in these communities grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with human creativity and alien precision. They played games that combined the best of both traditions, learned science from teachers of both species, and developed technologies that neither race could have imagined alone. These children would become the leaders of a future that neither of their parent species could have achieved on their own. Dr. Richard Hayes documented the medical miracles that were happening in the integrated communities. Diseases that had plagued both species for centuries were being cured through the combination of human, immune system research and alien medical technology. The adapted aliens developed resistances to conditions that had once been fatal, while humans gained access to treatments that extended life and improved health in ways that seemed almost magical. The first harvest festival in New Geneva brought together thousands of humans and adapted aliens to celebrate the bounty they had created together. The crops grown in the integrated farms were more nutritious and resilient than anything either species had produced alone.